All right, welcome back. So now we're going to talk about the different dynasties of China. So like I said, in a lot of ways, China didn't change all that much. Kublai Khan, who was really the first one to conquer China, Genghis didn't get all the way there, but he put Genghis in the record of emperors anyway. Kublai ran things a lot like an emperor would, and continued up the traditions of Confucianism and Buddhism and Taoism and whatnot. Um, but it does seem to have been much like any other Chinese dynasty in being relatively unified, relatively together. Only now Mongolia, the sort of home origin place of the Mongols, was incorporated into the empire as well. Now, Kublai Khan is a famous name, and his China is quite famous, in part because he was visited by a guy named Marco Polo. So Marco Polo went on a journey. He was a Venetian. He was from, Venice, which was all about trade and whatnot, and making money. And one of those big Italian city-states we've been talking about. And as a kind of scout, he went on a mission with his family. He was actually one of the younger people on the mission, but they traveled all the way into China, and eventually met up with Kublai Khan. So they basically explored this whole region between Venice and China, which is quite something, and wrote down a record of their travels. Specifically, Marco Polo dictated the story of his travels to someone else, and then that was published. And when this was published, using things like the printing press, this was a very big deal. This shaped how Europeans thought of as China. And it's interesting that they don't know too much about Mongols, or they don't focus too much on like the conquest of the Mongols and the horse archery. Instead, they focus on the grandeur and glory of China. So it's Kublai Khan's China that is the China that features in European imagination so often, even though from a certain perspective, some Chinese might have thought of him as an outsider. But he did, preserve the image and the grandeur and the glory. And Marco Polo writes about, the beautiful art and the beautiful jewels and gold and resources of China, and sort of leaves this sort of fantastic image in people's minds. And I like that this painting here doesn't really know what a Chinese person looks like, so just kind of depicts him in the clothes and outfits of a Western king. But this is, an attempt to depict a Marco Polo's journey. Yeah, and by all accounts, Kublai seemed to like Marco Polo, and hired him on certain missions to go explore his empire and to sort of, assess things and see how everybody was doing there since he wanted to travel around. He kind of used him as a lieutenant to do that. At least that's what Marco Polo always said. There's some debate on how much is Marco Polo making things up or trying to make himself look good, but at the very least, we are pretty sure that he did indeed meet Kublai Khan. And later on in poetry and art, Kublai Khan would come to mean, this king over all this sort of foreign glory. There's a poem that begins, "In Xanadu did Kublai Khan a stately pleasure dome decree." So, the idea of luxury and pleasure seemed to be what Europeans took away from Yuan China's court. I think, as with all Chinese dynasties, what the actual emperor would have probably focused on was more administration and how well he could provide the prosperity of his people in that way, in a sort of Confucian sense. But yeah, it's fun to kind of follow the path of Marco Polo's journey, him and his family, and you can see all the different places he visited along the way. He really got quite a lot of different regions under his belt here. And this is almost, looking forward to the age of exploration, which is the 1600s, where Europeans are, sailing around all over the place and conquering things. This is kind of, starting to shrink the world a little bit. Like all of this can be part of the same legacy, the same person's travel knowledge. But yeah, and over here we can see some of the other hordes. He passed through the Eel Khanate and the Golden Horde in the sort of Russia area, which is just a great name, the Golden Horde. But we can see they're already shrinking. Other folks like the Bedouins and the Mamluks who are also Muslim, are taking control. But yeah, here and we see that that India is still kind of doing its own thing over here. So this is kind of the 1200s, but it led to Europeans rethinking their image of the world. Now they didn't really know the shape of things yet, but they got the sense of that China was over here. Instead of an infinite, plane of continents stretching on and on, they realized there was an end to Asia, which is pretty cool. Okay, so we had the Yuan dynasty, and then ultimately it didn't last. Ultimately, not Muslim, Mongol rulers were rejected by the Chinese people, and it went back to being ruled by the Han Chinese ethnicity. Not that we want to go too nationalistic with it or anything like that. Just that at one point it was a sort of top-down hierarchy of Mongols on top, and then eventually those guys, their power was broken. The Khanates were no more, and we were back to the Chinese emperors of the usual flavor. So at that point, we had the Ming dynasty. So the Mongols were only in China for about 100 years or so. In the 1300s, you have the Ming dynasty, and the Mongols are pushed back to their home territory, which today is the country of Mongolia. And so the Ming Dynasty was a very prosperous time for China. It seems like this was a time when China was also more connected with the rest of the world through trade. Just as Europeans, as Venetians, were trying to make money by trading with China, China was finding new ways to trade with the rest of the world. And that led to a general high amount of prosperity. A lot of luxury culture, a lot of people making beautiful paintings and celebrating the design of their homes and their art. And it was a time where, beauty and luxury were being quite celebrated. And it seems like people were doing quite well. This is also the time when the Great Wall as we know it was built. There had been versions of the Great Wall, and there are still pieces of them here and there in much earlier Chinese dynasties. But this is the dynasty where they really set it out, established the walls that we still have and can see to this day. But most of it is a legacy from like the 1300s, 1400s period. And you got to think that maybe they didn't want to get invaded by the Mongols again. They were trying to keep them out because that's exactly where this wall would fall. Yeah, and it's interesting also that the Mongols kind of disappear from the historical record after this. They're still around. They're the people of Mongolia, but they stop conquering people on horseback. This might in part have to do with like their strategy worked really well for a certain period of time. But as time goes on, we're getting more into like gunpowder and cannons and guns, and horseback archers just cannot compete with that. So they were lucky that they struck when they did. But getting back to the Ming Dynasty, they continued the tradition of beautiful Chinese art. China is also a culture that celebrates calligraphy, beautiful writing, and this emphasis of sort of nature with a slight presence of humanity, but sort of emphasizing the bigness of nature. Here's a tiny person, a wise, sagely person, maybe some sort of Confucian or Taoist, in the context of this big natural world. That's what we see in Ming Dynasty art. And Ming Dynasty is really known for its pottery. This particular style over here on the right is actually, probably very famous as a style of Chinese art. You see it sort of imitated and parodied. And yeah, this was the Ming working in porcelain, which had been invented earlier, but they sort of perfected certain styles of painting on porcelain. You see the blue and white style very often, but also you can also see colors like here with this image of the fish. The Ming Dynasty was a time when art, especially pottery, was really taking off. Okay, so we had the Ming Dynasty. But despite all their work to keep, invaders from coming in, China gets invaded again. Or invaded on, depending on who you ask, I guess. The tricky thing is that all the sort of ethnicities and populations are kind of intertwined at this point. But back in the day, it was a surprise attack from the outside. And this was the arrival of the Manchurians. So the Manchurians would today be thought of as sort of living in the north of China, this region right here. Today, actually, it's one of the most sort of economically downtrodden regions in China. But at the time, they were able to mount a successful conquest of the rest of this region. And so the Manchu people who conquered the Han Chinese people, their dynasty became known as the Qing dynasty, Qing with a Q. That's just how we spell the transliteration of Chinese pronunciations. And the Qing dynasty managed to conquer the Mongolians and the Tibetans and what we think of as the core region of China today. In a lot of ways, they were influenced by Tibetan religion. I think the Mongols were too, a little bit. But the Qing ruled China from the 1600s up until the modern day. Didn't rule, no wait, yeah, they didn't rule Korea. They just had Korea pay tribute to them, give them money. Same with Nepal and Indonesia. And the Qing dynasty, yeah, features a lot in European stereotypes of China that are more relatively modern because the Qing dynasty had a lot more cause to interact with Europeans. Take a look at the outfit of a sort of typical Qing dynasty scholar. You've got this sort of round hat with a little fuzzy thing at the top. You've got a long braid known as a queue. And very often a Qing person wishing to appear cultured and sort of responsible would shave a part of his head, shave the top of his head. So you just have a little bit of hair at the top and most of it is in the braid at the back. And it took a while for, this seems to be a Manchu practice originally. It took a while for the rest of China to sort of adapt to it, but it became the thing that people would do. Like, you know, you go to work in a suit. This is what they would do in China would be go to work with their head shaved in the proper way and with the clothes of an official, also known as a mandarin. So yeah, this is the image that sometimes Europeans would use in stereotypes of China because in the 1900s, where Europeans and Chinese folks were interacting, sometimes going to war, that was the image that they had. Eventually, the Qing dynasty would fall apart and there would be a revolution, a series of revolutions actually, that would ultimately lead to people like Mao Zedong and China as we know it today. But the Qing is the last sort of dynasty style rule of China up until we get to modern Chinese politics. And the Qing dynasty, known for some very beautiful and impressive art. They had, I think, some influence from European art styles can be seen here, but also their interest in, you know, depicting people had been developing. I feel like you can kind of see some of the realism that you see in like Renaissance art with like the level of detail that's going on here, but also some of the openness and bigness of, you know, the traditional Tang and Song dynasty art. That, you know, shows the emphasis of space. So the emphasis of detail and the emphasis of space are combined here. It's interesting that the Qing did, you know, fight and conquer the Mongols, who were still around, and you know, and sometimes the Mongols could be a thorn in their side. So I just find it fascinating that we have this painting. Again, this is usually on silk, as has been the tradition throughout China. Silk being one of their big exports, actually. To have this image of this conquest, which is, you know, it feels a little bit like I've seen some European battle images, and it has that sort of twisting, turning, everybody, you know, there's so much chaos type of thing going on. And, you know, the level of detail in the back here, but also it's not trying to be as realistic as the Europeans. It's not trying to introduce like light in the same way. The colors are relatively flat and simplified. But clearly there is some spectacle and some grandeur in an image like this. We also see an emphasis on more sort of individual domestic scenes. You know, sort of ordinary life appears to be a theme in Qing dynasty art, just as it is in the European Renaissance, and even more in the Baroque period. So I almost wonder if there is a Western influence on this, or if this is you know, two parallel lines moving in the same direction. That in the Qing dynasty, there's also an emphasis on trying to understand ordinary people's lives. You know, we like to think that that Europeans invented the idea of being an individual, but I don't think that's really true. And I think China is kind of drawing on the same idea of celebrating individual lives and individual accomplishments, especially in the Qing dynasty. You also see some beautiful work. They have a very nice style with this gold and turquoise at the same time. It's cool. And they use these for, you know, like beautiful boxes to contain perfume and stuff like that. Yeah, so that's the Chinese art. Oh, I got one more for you. here is one. I really like the use of color in this one. This was very late Qing, and so I think probably was influenced by Europeans to some degree. Um, and you see the palace and this festival that's going on. And I just love the use of the reds and the greens and the blues here. You know, if we go back and compare some of the earlier art, it's very much, you know, ink and canvas, ink and silk. But here, you know, we're trying to experiment and use different colors and different approaches. So this is the 1900s. This is way outside the regular scope of our class, but I thought it would be good to know about the three big sort of Chinese dynasties that we can talk about here. And they interact with Europe during the time periods we're looking at in various ways. Qing Dynasty just a little bit in the 1600s. But if we go look at the timeline here, let's just kind of recap the timeline of things in Asia one more time. We have the first caliphate is the Umayyad Caliphate. This is the one that's started by Muhammad. That's the 600s and the 700s, so very comparable to medieval Europe. Then later medieval Europe is the Abbasid Caliphate. That's the one that had Harun al-Rashid and the great House of Wisdom in Baghdad, their basic library of Alexandria. Then we had the rise of the Mongols in the 1200s. So they controlled Yuan, China, up until 1368. Then we had the rise of the Ottomans kind of around the same time. You see the first evidence of the Ottomans, but I really think of them as a 1400s kind of thing. And that's in part because they are at their most successful in the 1400s. That's when they conquer Constantinople. Then around the same time, you've got Ming China from the 1300s to the 1600s. The last time China was a dynasty that wasn't an outsider dynasty. And then finally, you have the Manchu dynasty, the Qing dynasty in China from the 1600s to the 1900s. And today, it's kind of all blurred together in that you have Manchu, Mongol, and Han Chinese culture all being blended in this huge empire of many people. But that said, you know, the Han have their sort of emphasis on being, you know, the official Chinese, and so it can turn sort of nationalistic in some ways. But all of these are cultural influences on China as it is today, as well as ideas imported from the West. A lot of political thought and political theory went into the making of somebody like Mao Zedong. So hopefully this will help you guys kind of understand, you know, more of the context of how we got to the modern world. Because, you know, what is this class but medieval to modern? There's another class that goes specifically more into modern history, but this one, you know, having this backstory of the medieval period to now, I think what that looks like in China is thinking about these three big dynasties. But yeah, there's our timeline here. So it's quite a fascinating world we have going on. And I would love to be able to delve into it in more depth, but hopefully that gives you guys a taste. Okay, so no discussion for today's discussion question because it is Wednesday, but the thing for this week is you're going to have the quiz on both the Renaissance stuff from yesterday and a little bit of the Ottoman and China stuff. I don't think there's stuff outside of Ottomans and China there. So it's going to be stuff that's familiar from the book, from the very scant bits of information that the book talks about for Mongols and later China and for the Ottomans. So that's what to expect. If you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with me. I'm always down to chat by email. In any case, take care, and I will see you on Monday.